Okay, I think we should get started. So welcome to our webinar series of the UK Climate Resilience Programme. My name is Suraje Dessai. I'm a Professor of Climate Change Adaptation at the University of Leeds and one of the champions, together with Kate Lonsdale, of this programme. Today, it's a great pleasure to have Andrew Carr and Chris Bishop from DEFRA, who are going to talk to us about the government approaches to domestic adaptation and resilience. Andrew is head of evidence in adaptation, and Chris is an economic advisor in the evidence team. And Andrew's going to tell us a little bit about the policy side of things and some of the issues of how science gets into policy. And Chris is going to give us a bit of an overview of how economics is dealt with in adaptation. But before I pass on to Andrew and Chris, I'm just going to tell you a few news from the program. But before I do that, actually, let me just tell you, I mean, those of you who've attended this before will know this, but if you're new, we will do the presentations first. You've got the Q&A box on Zoom there, so please post your questions there at any point in time, and do use the upvote so that we can see what are the favorite questions. Most likely attendees will remain muted unless we have some time to enable you to speak in the Q&A session. But we're recording this. It's actually live on YouTube now, and so you can share that and you can see this later as well. So use the chat if you do have some technical problems. But if you are having problems here in Zoom, you can, as I say, watch this on YouTube live as well, and you can find the link on our Twitter handle. So a couple of news from the program. There's more papers coming out, thick and fast, really. Met Office colleagues have published some work looking at the urban heat tidal effect under a changing climate, particularly looking at temperature. So William Keat has led that work. And then Daniel Cottrell has been looking at precipitation in the autumn in particular, and how that's been changing both in the past and in the future as well. So have a look at some of those papers. And Nigel Arnell and colleagues have published another paper looking at climate risk indicators for the UK at different warming levels. And in fact, that work is actually about to go online. So in the next week or two, we're going to make this available through the program website, and it might be hosted in a different link, but we'll certainly put links to this. And Nigel and colleagues have been developing these indicators of climate risk. So I've got some examples there at the bottom. So, heat extremes like tropical nights, but other indicators that are particularly relevant for decision makers. So in transport, for example, road melt risk, growing season length for agriculture, wildfire as well. So you'll be able to access this on the website very soon, and you'll be able to explore the different variations as well. So outputs for annually, you might want to look at summer or winter, but then also particularly these warming levels, building on that paper that I just mentioned. So, 2 degrees, 1.5 degrees, 3 degrees, different RCPs, and then exploring again the different levels that you've got, the different products you've got on UK CP18. So the global projections, the regional projections, the probabilistic ones, and then finally, you can actually also have different levels of spatial resolution. So at the 12-kilometer all the way up to the nation level of England, Wales, Northern Ireland, and Scotland. And you'll be able to get that for different time periods, like, usually 20 or 30-year time periods. And you'll be able to see the results visually in this type of map, and then also as a time series as well. And I think Nigel's actually working on trying to be able to download that in a GIS format. This will be coming out pretty soon, so keep an eye out for this. A lot of energy is being focused on COP, and certainly the program will be there, and hopefully we'll be able to share more details very soon. But one thing that's definitely happening in the green zone is the Risky Cities Projects team are actually delivering a co-created theatrical intervention with the National Youth Theatre on the 5th of November. So if you are in Glasgow, do try to attend this, this event. I think it'll be really, really interesting. It's one of the AHRC funded projects that's based in Hull. And it's exploring a variety of youth themes around, eco-anxiety and climate uncertainty. So includes poetry, music, short film. So it's a really interesting project. So if you're in Glasgow, do come and attend. A couple of just extra announcements. There's a Waterline Summit happening very soon that Lee Pitcher, who's involved in the Magic project, is hosting, and so if you're interested in water risks and climate change, do have a look at that. The web link is there at the bottom. And then the other event that's happening is there's going to be a second forum on scenarios of future climate and future society. So IASA in Luxembourg in Austria is hosting this second forum. And so if you are doing research that's, for example, utilizing either climate scenarios or the socioeconomic scenarios, for example, that the program has developed, this forum is having a call for proposals for sessions now up until the 15th of November. So have a look at that website. There'll be a call for abstracts a little bit later once the sessions have been decided. So finally, just a couple of wider news as well. There were 2 reports came out very recently. So I was involved in one of them. So the Center for Climate Change Economics and Policy yesterday launched a report looking at how our UK organizations prepared for the physical risks of climate change. And so you can go and have a look at that report and the webinar we did yesterday. I've put there a bit of a headline finding there that 7 in 8 UK organizations are not prepared for the impacts of climate change, but we have a lot more data. It's based on a large-scale survey of over 2,400 respondents, and you can get more details on the website. But the other thing that came out today and was kind of profiled yesterday in the media was the 3rd adaptation report of the Environment Agency. So that's actually out now, and you can go and have a look. There was quite a bit of coverage yesterday about the need for adaptation and the importance of adaptation, just as vital as mitigation. So I'll stop here now and hand over to Andrew and Chris to tell us more about the government approach for domestic adaptation and resilience. So I'll stop sharing my screen and hand over to you, Chris, to take control. Yeah, you can see your slides. Perfect.
Great. Thanks, Suraj. Can you hear me okay? Is that all right?
Yeah.
Great.
Loud and clear.
Suraj. Perfect. And hello, everybody. Very glad to be joining you all today and to have this opportunity to provide an overview of how government operates and delivers on adaptation. I suppose you'd say it's particularly exciting and pertinent, being less than 3 weeks away from COP26 and alongside all of the flagship publications we had over the summer from the CCC. So I'll begin by providing a summary of DEFRA's responsibilities on behalf of UK governments, alongside the legal basis of such responsibilities and our statutory timelines. I'll then hand over to my colleague, Chris, who will provide an insight into our economic guidance on adaptation before finishing up on highlighting what my team does and outlining some key research programs we're involved in that have or will be supporting policymaking. Next slide, please, Chris. So first and foremost, what does DEFRA do when it comes to climate change? Well, the department holds 2 core areas of responsibility, starting rather unorthodoxly here with the bottom paragraph. And just to provide a bit of context on the mitigation side, we support the government lead in BEIS through our efforts to tackle emissions in our relevant sectors. No surprises what those are, with a particular challenge for us on agriculture. What this support looks like includes activities such as pushing forward research efforts to better quantify and constrain uncertainties in emissions and sinks, ensuring targets are driven towards through better policy and working to empower the stakeholders who work in our sectors so they can take the necessary action. You'll see on the slide there, as our sectors total 15% of all UK emissions, it is vital that we deliver reductions to keep 1.5 degrees alive and limit catastrophic warming as much as possible. But we're not here to talk about mitigation. So on adaptation, the top paragraph, DEFRA, for those who don't know, is the UK government lead for England on adaptation, with the devolved administrations handling their own policies whilst working with us on all of UK issues. That means that the buck stops with DEFRA on ensuring adaptation policies are delivered to build resilience to climate change across all relevant sectors, and we are legally obliged to fund and produce certain publications and bodies to work towards this. Now, thanks to the exceptional research capabilities the UK has on climate change, we know the 5-degree warming scenario will have significant impacts on a multitude of sectors across the country. And equally, we're acutely aware that scenarios beyond 1.5 degrees, that is to say, scenarios such as 2 and 4 degrees of warming, would have increasingly catastrophic impacts. These are facts that we have at the forefront of our minds when considering A, what research gaps we must fill, and B, what policies and actions we need to drive forward. Next slide, please, Chris. So whilst that all seems fairly doom and gloom, I'd like to outline exactly why DEFRA has these responsibilities and how this legal basis and what it's generated actually represents one of the world's foremost statutory frameworks to support adaptation endeavours. I'm sure we're all aware of the 2008 Climate Change Act. It made the UK the world's first nation to establish a legal process to adapt to the risks and impacts of climate change. The major body inaugurated via this act was the Climate Change Committee, which was set up to advise the UK and devolved governments on the risks of climate change, whilst also tracking our progress in managing those risks. Now, we at DEFRA work extremely closely with the CCC on a variety of activities, and one of the most important of these is the Climate Change Risk Assessment, or CCRA. Now, there can be some confusion on who delivers what regarding the CCRA, and I'll explain this when I speak about research endeavours later on in an attempt to clear up any of that ambiguity. But the basics are the CCC is legally obliged to provide advice to governments on the risks of climate change every 5 years, whilst we are legally obliged to set out those risks that the UK faces. And we basically look to the CCC's advice and findings to inform what we develop in our reports. So the CCRA rather establishes our primary evidence base to take action upon. So how do we outline such action? This is done through another legally bound publication known as the National Adaptation Programme, or NAP, also delivered on a 5-year cycle, usually a year or so subsequent to the CCRA. It provides a detailed overview of what the government's objectives, proposals, and policies are in order to address the risks set out in the CCRA, and is a huge collaborative endeavour across all departments, which DEFRA takes the lead in as a department in pulling together all the activities across government into the NAP, publishing it as well, and also monitoring how the actions are progressing over the 5-year validity period. So for additional quality assurance and to ensure the government is held to account in the public domain, the CCC is also obliged to deliver a progress report on adapting to climate change every 2 years. This scrutinises the progress of the NAP, highlighting how far we've come over a 24-month period in taking adaptation policies and actions forward in order to reduce risk. The final element of the Act, you can see at the bottom there, is known as the Adaptation Reporting Power, or ARP. What this basically allows is it empowers our Secretary of State to request reports from bodies and organisations based in the UK to detail what actions they're taking to adapt to climate change. So a sort of spot checking exercise to assess the level of efforts made across different industries. Next slide, please, Chris. So my last overview slide simply articulates how these statutory requirements are delivered. So over what timeframes and by whom. You'll see along the top, the CCC delivers what's above that dateline, and what we in government publish is below that dateline. So we're currently in our third 5-yearly cycle of publications for the CCRA and the NAP. So you see CCRA 3 published by government in January next year, and the third NAP is due in early 2023, alongside another progress report that summer, which will be the final appraisal of the NAP2 period. So I'll stop there from an overview perspective and come back in a bit to more detail. I'll hand over to Chris to talk you through an overview of our economic guidance approach, and I'll be back a little bit later on. Chris, would you like to take over?
Thank you very much, Andrew. Right. So as Andrew said, I'm hopefully going to talk through some of the economic guidance that we have developed and that we use within not only the climate team, but across government. As a good economist, I'll caveat a couple of things to start with to say this is very much a whistle-stop tour of some of the guidance that we have to date. And it's very much what we see as some of the first steps that we're trying to keep under review, and we'll plan to update with specific examples and things in practice as we develop them over time. So for those that don't know, within government, we generally try and follow the ROMEF cycle when we're developing policies, projects and programs. And so we have to demonstrate that there is clear rationale for government intervention. We have to set out why there are objectives and what we're trying to achieve. We then have to appraise multiple options in order to identify an option which is preferred and then taken forward. We then have to monitor and evaluate how these options are delivered. And then we use that monitoring to then feed back any policy changes or project changes over time. And so I'll predominantly be talking about the analysis stage, which as an economist is very much informed by Green Book guidance. And this is guidance set out by the Treasury, which outlines how good an appraisal should be undertaken. And there's a whole host of supplementary guidance documents alongside the Green Book, which help to inform sort of environmental appraisal, or in this case, climate and adaptation appraisal, which is what I'll be talking through today. And this process is very much informed by analysts, science, policy colleagues across the professions throughout when policy projects or programs are delivered. So one could very well argue that current economic analysis or economic thinking falls short of in terms of accounting for climate change. If you look to the traditional Green Book guidance, you'll see this sort of flow chart at the top of the slide, which starts out with the rationale. You develop these options, you appraise them, you make a decision, and you monitor them. What this fails to often account for is the level of detail and climate effects within the appraisal section. And that can be broken down into a number of things. One, guidance on incorporating climate into appraisal within government has fallen short up until recently, and I think is something we continue to seek to develop and build upon. And so one of the first things we've done is update some of the supplementary guidance, which is where a lot of this information that I'll be talking through comes from today. There's also very much live discussions within economics on things like discounting and how that plays into appraisal, where we have, if we use sort of higher discount rates, then this can promote projects that deliver benefits on a sort of shorter timescale, which is very much not necessarily the case in a lot of climate projects. And so that's something that is still not settled. There's also a whole conversation around carbon prices and the social cost of carbon. BEIS have recently updated this guidance to say that the carbon prices that are now being used are sort of almost 200% higher than they were a year or so ago, particularly in sort of the coming decades. And so what we sought to do was to update the guidance with a lot of these things in light and develop this sort of supplementary approach, which is in the bottom half of the slide here. And so as normal, we would develop this sort of policy rationale and options, but as a first stage, we also need to identify whether there are climate risks and adaptation options that are available or suitable for a particular project, policy or program. Once you've identified whether they are or are not appropriate for this, and I'll detail a bit more in shortly, we then have to appraise the sort of costs and benefits, which is the traditional sort of economist bread and butter. However, more often than not, climate is not factored into those appraisals in terms of having them in a baseline scenario. And so this guidance we developed tries to look at a sort of 2-degree and a 4-degree scenario, where in the most sort of extreme cases, so that benefits and costs have climate affecting them, and that we're not ignoring them. And then the third stage is then looking at things on flexibility and adaptation in particular, where it may not necessarily be the case that options that demonstrate the most value for money are the most climate sort of averse or incorporate the sort of best options that climate needs. So there's a whole section on decision making almost under uncertainty as well. If I move on to the next slide. So with this first option within the guidance that we developed, one of the first things that we sought to set out was to identify whether climate risks are appropriate for certain policies, projects or programs. And so we developed a sort of triage stage where we would look through and develop a series of questions to help economists across government inform whether a more detailed analysis needs to be undertaken. And so, for example, if policies are being developed in response directly to CCRA risks, then there's things that we'll obviously need to take out a sort of risk assessment and identify the potential impacts. And so you'd move to the right-hand side and into this sort of stage 2. We used UK CP18 information from the Met Office to try and set out some rough timelines as to the effects that might take place, and broadly settled on a timeline of if projects were over or taking longer than 2035, then we need to do something that's a lot more in-depth than something that is on a sort of shorter time scale. So that follows that sort of 3-step approach. The second stage is then looking at having those climate effects and those scenarios within the appraisal that is taking place. So an example here is where we're looking at sort of peatland restoration, and you can see that the range of benefits under a no climate change scenario shown by those kind of blue bars, and how that is affected under different climate scenarios. It may be possible to sort of ascertain certain sort of hazards and risks from these different scenarios, and that's what we try and seek to do with this guidance, is help to pull those together into what may or may not have an impact on the costs and benefits that are being determined. And as I say, we are focusing particularly on a sort of 2 and 4 degree scenario in this case. The final step is then obviously this sort of monitoring and evaluation side of things. So it may be more applicable once the analysis has been undertaken, to choose options that present more flexibility over time or that can be adapted to climate change. What we want to try and avoid is choosing options that specifically lock us into certain pathways or are unable to cope with climate risks as they change over time. However, we know that there's lots of complex interactions between sort of social, economic and environmental factors, which are particularly difficult to identify through adaptation indicators and things like this. We need to make sure that these policies have a strong monitoring and evaluation framework so that as they progress, we know whether they're having a particular impact on what they set out to do within their rationale and their objectives. And we need to know the future options of what might be available. So when they are reviewed and they are evaluated, whether they can be adapted again further over time. And it may not necessarily be the case that traditional cost benefit analysis is always the right appraisal method to undertake with this analysis. There are obviously lots of decision making under uncertainty methods that can be used as sort of shown in the figure there. And so something we're also trying to promote is development in other techniques alongside cost benefit analysis, which may, as I say, not always be the case in that sort of area. So what we've tried to do with this guidance is sort of build on this traditional cost benefit approach, looking to account for 2 and 4 degree scenarios and building in adaptation and decision making under uncertainty. However, this is definitely something that we need to sort of build on and push more onto economists across government. And that's a very whistle-stop tour from me. So I will pass back to Andrew to talk through some climate research.
Thanks, Chris. So change pace now in order to give you an insight into what we do internally as a team and also touch on some of the research projects involved in. I'm going to outline my team's role and responsibilities and do another whistle stop.
Sorry, Andrew, your mics have stopped working.
Sorry, can you hear me? Is that better?
Yeah, that's better. Okay.
Yeah, okay. So just to preface talking about research and what my team does, we understand how vital scientific research is in underpinning decision making. It's our jobs to make sure this is at the heart of all adaptation measures taken by policy colleagues across government. And we all know on our side that without the exceptional world-leading science produced in the UK, we would have little to no idea of how or why the climate is changing, let alone what the risks and impacts will be here or how we can effectively manage these. This is why teams like mine exist in governments, to ensure this principle remains at the forefront of all we do to tackle climate change. So for adaptation at DEFRA, this is the climate evidence team within the climate division, which I sit on, heading up our adaptation science endeavors. So we exist to provide scientific and economic support to both the mitigation and adaptation policy teams who make up the bulk of the rest of our division. The latter of whom, so the adaptation policy team, are responsible for delivering the National Adaptation Programme and the adaptation reporting powers. We ensure the requirements of policy are met through provision and translation of existing evidence, whilst also identifying and commissioning development of new research where we've deemed a gap to exist. So we participate and steer various programs across the UK to ensure the research they're producing meets the needs of our end users in policy teams across governments, including the UK Climate Resilience Programme itself, which was established with guidance from DEFRA, with this as one of its primary purposes. So where our policy team is responsible for delivering things like the NAP, we in evidence are responsible for delivering the CCRA, and we are both responsible for funding a large chunk of the CCC's adaptation committee work. That is to say, the evidence and policy teams, the budget that we have largely goes towards the CCC's adaptation committee work. The adaptation committee are those who deliver the evidence synthesis published earlier this summer, alongside the advice to governments and the progress report on adaptation you'll have also seen back in June. Next slide, please, Chris. So, I think this might be the other slide deck. The next slide is on the CCRA, Chris, sorry. It's the latest one I sent, so it should be right at the end and we can work. Yeah, so now I mentioned confusion earlier around the CCRA. For some clarity, as stipulated in the Climate Change Act, UK government must deliver an assessment of the risks and opportunities from climate change every 5 years. We do this through a publication on gov.uk known as the CCRA, which is also laid before Parliament, and we're due to lay the third in January next year. However, for the past two CCRAs, so the second and third, we've commissioned the CCC to deliver an enormous synthesis of evidence to accompany their statutory advice to us and to support us in our position on understanding climate risk on as a detailed level as possible. You'll have all seen the extraordinary publication of this in June. This was known as the UK Independent Assessment of Climate Risk, previously known as the evidence report within the last cycle, so the second cycle, which we went to great lengths over the past few years to present. It went to great lengths rather to present a comprehensive evidence base for different sectors to look to when trying to understand implications of climate for themselves. Now, I won't go into great detail about what the results were, as I believe the CCC has presented on such this forum previously, but a key output for us is summarized in the graphic on this slide, which displays 8 priority risk areas for urgent action over the next 2 years, something we are acutely aware of within our teams and have been taking action to drive momentum on since the publication in June. Part of this action is our review of the whole independent assessment as we develop our government publication through the rest of the year for publication in January, which will be known as the CCRA 3. Reiterate that this entire process, it goes without saying, it's absolutely vital for us in government in understanding what threats we face from climate change. And we're already discussing what the ambitions are for the 4th CCRA, looking to the recommendations from the CCC and conducting our own gap analysis with stakeholders to identify where research priorities should focus. Can we go back a couple of slides, Chris, to speak to the Met Office Hadley Centre programme? Great. So the next couple of slides, the next 3 slides, I won't take you through in too much detail. I've added them so people can read at their leisure. They speak to some of the key research projects and programs we're currently involved in, which most of you should be familiar with, although there are some that are relatively new that I'll touch on. I haven't detailed the UK Climate Resilience Programme, as I'd imagine that considering you're all here, you're all aware of how important this is and has been for government over the last few years. But with the Met Office Hadley Centre Climate Programme, which has just entered its next research cycle, this is a flagship effort that generates critical climate science to support policymaking, not just in DEFRA, but across all of governments, and is led by 4 key government questions that we've asked that you can see on the slide there, spanning what underpinning climate science we need, mitigation approaches, and the input and output side of adaptation. In essence, what risks are we facing and what actions should we take? DEFRA is a huge customer of this program on the adaptation side, as you can imagine, and our team continues to help articulate the user needs within our department and for our stakeholders across the country so the Hadley Centre can pinpoint and target research gaps effectively. Next slide, please, Chris. So a key output from a previous Hadley Centre round of funding is the UK Climate Projections that, again, you're probably all aware of, launched in 2018, funded by BEIS and DEFRA. These are the world-leading projections that provide unprecedented levels of detail for scientists like ourselves in understanding and translating changes in variables such as temperature and precipitation for policy teams across government. Particularly revolutionary is the more localized scale, the 2.2 kilometer grid square resolution option, something that has historically been a major challenge in adaptation, essentially being able to support place-based decision-making. So that's been extremely helpful for us since publication, and we're building on that with other endeavors that I'll speak to in a second. The projections were also key in being able to increase confidence across the urgency of different risks within the CCC's independent assessment published earlier this year. And overall will continue to be an important tool for the CCRA process as we go forward. So we're currently working with BEIS and the Met Office and reviewing the end user needs around these projections to ensure we're maximizing awareness, usability, and accessibility. That's the focus we have with UKCP going forward. Next slide, please. So moving into more recent novel activities we're undertaking, the challenge of being effectively able to monitor adaptation progress, something that's been an issue for a very long time. One of the headline recommendations from the CCC this summer was around better funding of research and action on adaptation indicators. So the evidence team has heeded this advice and has already begun a program of work which seeks to close this evidence gap, working closely with the CCC, the OECD, academia, and our end users to assess what the nation's strengths and weaknesses are in this space, so as to pursue research into areas of ambiguity, understand the needs of sector teams who benefit from tracking policy impact, and setting out to identify, develop, and collate data sets to implement within the UK, alongside drawing from international best practice, which is why we have the OECD involved. Incidentally, we're going to be showcasing that work at COP26 with the OECD. If anyone's interested in hearing more, TBD on exactly the day for that, but we'll try and get that out through a relevant network if anyone's interested. Next slide, please. Finally, this will be the last slide I speak to. You may have heard a recent announcement about this program, the BEIS-led CS Now, which stands for Climate Services for a Net Zero Resilient World, just been publicly announced as a new £5 million effort to look at the latest climate services needs for government, and our team are playing a key role in shaping the adaptation work packages of this, again, as representatives of our end users. I won't speak any more to that as it's very new, but there's a bit of information there on the slide, so you can see the different work packages that will be developed as part of that project. So I hope that has provided a reasonable insight to how much we value and utilize climate research for adaptation within governments. Again, I didn't mention UK Climate Resilience Programme, as I expect you're all aware of its importance, but I'd like to reiterate what a fantastic job it's done since its inception, and note that as per the other endeavors and programs I've mentioned, we're also playing an active role in steering its outputs to meet the needs of our end users, and are working closely with the champions to ensure the program's legacy is preserved subsequently to its closure in early 2023. Suraj, I'd like to finish with a quick plug, if I may. So DEFRA will be hosting an event on climate risk at COP26 with the FCDO, CCC, Met Office, and the University of Exeter. This will be on Adaptation, Loss and Damage Day, so the 8th of November. It'll take place on the UK Pavilion with a breakfast reception starting at 8:30 and an event start at 9 a.m. We'll basically be showcasing the CCRA alongside Global South approaches to risk assessments. Great set of panelists. My lights have just gone out, sorry. With an opening speech delivered by our Minister of State, Lord Goldsmith. So I really hope to see everybody there, and hopefully we'll have an invite out through this network as well in due course when we get confirmation. Thanks, Suraj. I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you very much, Andrew and Chris, for that tour of both policy and economics. Please go ahead and put your questions on the Q&A. We've got quite a bunch of questions already there, but keep them coming. I was going to go first, if I may, and I wanted to ask you, Chris, if you could say a little bit more about how this new supplementary guidance has gone down, because I think it was sort of launched in November. So there's almost about a year of it being out, and I just wonder how it's being applied across government. I guess it'd be good to get a bit of a feel for that, particularly because we have so many other things happening. So the Treasury's got a roadmap for mandatory climate disclosure. So I guess it'd be interesting to hear from you whether you think, for example, that the supplementary guidance could be applied by, for example, private sector companies, local authorities in terms of planning for adaptation. So I just wonder, whether you could share some views on how it's gone down and how it's being sort of socialized across government.
Sure. I'd say so. When it was released, it was sort of shared across all the departments, and as part of the most recent spending review that's been ongoing, all the latest guidance gets shared across all the departments, so everyone's aware of all the latest information for those that are putting proposals and things together. I'd say it's definitely something that we need to keep pushing. I think there's from a personal view, I think there's probably a lack of expertise in economists across government in applying some of this more niche guidance across government. And so I think DEFRA is doing a good job, but I think we can do a lot more. And I think it's around building and training some of the capacity and skills of other economists across government to do this and put more in practice, essentially. There is a whole host of training on the Green Book itself, but there's less available on specific supplementary guidance. And I think that's definitely an area of growth where we need to look into. In terms of the second part of your question around, could this be applied by sort of private sector businesses, etc.? I think it could be used particularly as some sort of guidance to help them think more about how they might take this into account. I don't think it's, as I said at the start, I think it's a good first step in the right direction, and particularly keen for feedback from those that use it and those that have read it, in order for us to help continue to develop that, because it is quite a step in a new direction for economics, incorporating some of this side of things. So I think it's been a good start. I think there's plenty more to go.
Great, thanks very much, Chris. I'm going to move to the most popular of our questions that we've got now. Maybe this one's for you to start off with, Andrew. Could you say a bit more about how DEFRA motivates action on adaptation across other government departments?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we're all well aware historically of where adaptation falls in terms of people's mindsets when compared to mitigation. It's commonly referred to as mitigation's poorer cousin. It's a challenge that we've had to deal with as the department leads, the government leads for quite a long time now. We've made really good progress on being able to get it up towards a level pegging with priorities on mitigation and net zero. The way we do that is essentially we have a series of governance groups that we have established that we control in the climate division at varying levels across government, which has membership from all government departments at the working level, at senior officials level as well. And then sitting above that are ministerial groups that feed directly up to the PM. And essentially, we pull on those mechanisms and those levers as the secretariats for the working level and the senior officials level groups on adaptation. And we use those as our main mechanism to try and motivate and galvanize action. I think what's been really helpful is what the CCC, the exceptional work the CCC has done, particularly with the 2 publications this year, in terms of raising awareness, both with the professionalism of the launch of the independent assessment, but also the sheer scale and comprehensive nature of the assessment as well. And critically drawing attention to the fact that a lot of mitigation, a lot of net zero priorities are impacted by adaptation and climate risk. Looking at natural carbon stores, looking at the energy grids, that type of thing. Achieving net zero through preserving carbon sinks, natural carbon sinks. If they're not well adapted, if they're not resilient to climate change, they're not going to work effectively. We're aware of that, but a lot of people haven't quite made that join up until the CCC really hammered that point home. And I'm speaking about non-technical, non-scientists, those type of people who maybe make more of the decisions. And they've done a great job of highlighting that. And we've seen a lot of traction around that subsequently. So basically, we have the governance in place, we're utilizing it, we're driving forward ambition across departments and speaking all the time to other departments. And we've also been hugely benefited by what the CCC has revealed, and the synergies with net zero and the impacts on that has really galvanized action in that area.
Thanks. I've got a question from Sean here. How does DEFRA work with and support stakeholders adapting at different scales? For example, local authorities or community groups? It's probably a question for your policy colleagues, but I hope you can shed some light there, Andrew or Chris.
I could try to field that as best I can from an evidence side. So policy colleagues have a specific engagement with what was the Ministry for Housing, Communities and Local Governments. I can't quite remember the acronym of that now, that it's been changed recently to Levelling Up, but that is our gateway into local government and communities, and we work closely with them essentially on translating various elements of policy that we're taking from the centre and being able to empower them to understand, as the central department on local government and communities, how they need to disseminate that to their respective stakeholders. We don't have particularly a direct link with local government and communities. We rely on that department to do that for us. It's kind of tricky because we essentially sit at the very tip of the pyramid at the top in terms of the legislation that we're responsible for. So we don't quite have the resourcing to engage directly with these authorities and communities. So a lot of that falls to what was MHCLG. We work closely with them to make sure they understand on a national scale what they need to be responsible for in terms of bringing that down to local scales. And also speaking more to the evidence side of things, one of the flagship challenges on adaptation is place-based decision making and be able to spatially delineate climate risk. So actually local authorities and communities can make those decisions rather than just being at regional or national scale. And we have a huge focus on that going forward with the research that we're funding. So we're hoping that is going to really remove this blocker and support what the UKCP 18 has already done, and Nigel Arnell's work as well, which is fantastic, incidentally, in doing that.
Great, thanks, Andrew. There's a question here which I think you could have a go at as well, which was, sorry, it's moving around a bit now, which is what, especially where you sit, what makes research most effective and usable from a DEFRA perspective?
Yeah, so I think the thing that I've learned from being in this post and from having discussions with end users and reviewing research projects, programs and their outputs, etc., is the bottom-up approach is vital in being able to deliver effective and usable research.
Breaking up.
Oh, sorry.
He's still there, Chris.
Is that all right? Suraje, you froze on screen, but hopefully, Chris, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Great. Yeah, sorry. So just from the time being in post, understanding end user needs, so the bottom-up approach, being able to recognize directly, working backwards from the policy teams, the sector teams who rely on this research to steer their policy decisions, is how we understand what makes research effective and usable. We don't know until we speak to the individuals that need the information at the end of the line. So it's something that we really place emphasis on when communicating with all the research programs that we engage with, is we need to work backwards from the end user, and we need to have them involved from the beginning through workshops, etc., and they can shape what they need. And that needs to be the principle across all research, quite frankly, in my opinion. I think we've lost Suraje, so Jane and Jenny.
Andrew, there's a question from Helen McIntyre. I'll just read that out for you. It's a really interesting talk, thanks. How is potential maladaptation being considered in this work in the context of climate uncertainty, but also other uncertainties, e.g. economic, societal?
Yeah, so maladaptation is something we absolutely consider. I mean, you look at the CCC's advice this summer, and in particular the 10 principles for good adaptation that they released is something we're taking very seriously. That nods towards making sure we understand what could potentially lead to maladaptation, whether it be inaction or taking the wrong type of action. It's prominent for every risk throughout the CC, throughout the independent assessments that we're reviewing at the moment. And it's on us in the evidence team, to basically make sure that people are aware of that in sector teams, to understand that they need to be aware of the decisions they make and modeling what potential maladaptation could happen from that decision making. In the contexts that you set out, climate uncertainty, we rely heavily on the Met Office Hadley Centre Climate Programme to generate the data that helps us understand climate uncertainty and climate sensitivity. There's obviously, we're never going to constrain that to certainty, where we handle those confidence intervals as you would in academia. We have to make an educated decision based on the information we have at hand, and that's just the way it is. But we do have, I would say, a reasonably good grasp or confidence in the decisions that we're making when it comes to climate uncertainty. When it comes to other uncertainties, so economic and societal, this is something that we're really focused on now in terms of pushing forward, because I think with the physical science, we have a great handle on. We have great institutions in the country. We have great science being generated, world-leading science that informs everything from our policies to delivering for the IPCC, for UNFCCC policymaking. But societal, behavioral, those types of sciences are emerging for us, and something that we want to know more about, and something that we're keen to do more research into. So that for us is a priority going forward.
I think also just a couple of other points, just on what the last points that Andrew said there. I think there's a couple of things from my side that we're trying to look into. One is particularly pushing sort of no regret options, so that we try and avoid some of these more complicated options or adaptation options that could lead to maladaptation. But also, as I mentioned, looking into these decision making under uncertainty and looking at other methods beyond, say, simple cost benefit analysis or other decision making mechanisms to help inform and take account of other levels of uncertainty within these things.
Great. Thanks. Apologies, I dropped out very briefly. But just a plug from the program there, Andrew. I mean, one of the things we have invested in is the UK, known as the UK SSPs, the Shared Socioeconomic Pathways. And so they describe future evolutions of how the UK could evolve, how society could evolve, how the economy could evolve, and that definitely, could be utilized in combination with climate scenarios to actually look holistically at risk, and it'd be great to see it applied, in together with the supplementary guidance, for example, to assess projects, net present value or programs and so on. So I'll have to watch the recording for that question about what makes research most effective and usable. But I want to pick up here maybe on Pete Falloon's question about food systems. So the UK food chain is complex with strong domestic and international components and a mix of actors, including policy, business and government. How do you think the UK food system can best move forward with adaptation in a joined up way? Again, I realize this is more, in sort of DEFRA policy in agriculture, but if you've got an inkling, it'd be good to hear about it.
Happy to give sort of candid thoughts on it in any case. So it's one of the more challenging risks from the independent assessment. You'll have seen the 8 priority risk areas that were published by the CCC in their advice, and one of those is around supply chains, with food obviously being a component of that. The challenge is the responsibility is spread across multiple organizations and departments to ensure a cohesive response to a risk area like that requires a collective effort. And sometimes collective efforts can be challenging to galvanize in any group of organizations, as I'm sure everyone has experienced. So in terms of what we can do, and this is something actually, incidentally, we've had good provisional success with through something we're doing around seconding academics into these 8 areas that we have. We've been seeking out academics to come in and support policy teams directly to try and reduce the risks urgently across the next 2 years, as set out by the CCC. And within that, one of the main focuses is on these food supply chains. And being able to basically bring academia into the heart of governments, into the sector teams directly, circumventing us, because sometimes we can be a hindrance to that type of thing. We can just facilitate that and have them sort of advise, train and prepare those sector teams for the next NAP, so the policies are effective at reducing that risk, is one step we can do within DEFRA. It's a different challenge across governments, and it's another challenge altogether to do it for a whole of country approach. But initial thoughts is it requires open lines of communication between everybody in a setting that we have regular engagement and we listen to people's needs. Again, going back to what makes research good, it also is what makes decision making good, is listening to who is this impacting, businesses, communities, etc., on food supply chains. Therefore, how do we respond to what they need, rather than thinking in our own heads trying to figure out what they need ourselves. So that would be a first start. Again, I can't speak more to it because I'm not in that sector, but that would be a first stop to be able to raise awareness on adaptation in those areas, because I think sometimes people aren't quite aware of the impacts that climate is going to have on these things, because it's quite siloed in some instances. So initial thoughts, sorry.
No, thank you very much. And I'll push you just a little bit further with a final question. We can just squeeze this one in, which is from Hazel Jeffrey, which I think is building on this theme again, which is, different government departments have got individual targets. So how do you ensure that things become joined up? Land use could be for renewables, agriculture, housing, involves lots of different departments. And that's one of the big challenges of adaptation, that it's cross-cutting. So how are you folks sort of getting a handle on that?
Yeah, well, I think there are a couple of things. I've already mentioned a couple of things that we join together with other government departments on via governance, etc. And just going back to things like the CCC's progress report and the independent assessment. In particular, if you look at the progress report, it really lays bare in the 9-box grids the performance of different sectors and performing, whether they're reducing the gap in adaptation, whether the climate risk is increasing, that type of thing. And that publication is really a great tool for us in DEFRA to go to other departments and say, look at what this says. This is saying we're less prepared for climate change than we were 5 years ago in certain sectors. You need to take action. We need to galvanize that. And that gets the attention of seniors, a ministerial level attention, which is what's most important in driving action in other departments. So utilizing tools like that, high profile tools and evidence that are around the public domain to try and drive action is really, really important. And that's something we're doing actively at the moment through those governance groups that I mentioned, and it's working. People are paying attention. It helps having COP26 this year, obviously, but we're working towards that and a post COP26 environment where we can sustain that momentum.
Brilliant. Thanks so much. I mean, I think there's two very quick questions we can answer fairly quickly. The gap analysis you're doing with stakeholders on CCRA4, I think that includes the devolved administrations, doesn't it, Andrew?
Yeah, of course. When I mentioned that, I simply meant we were thinking about it. The action analysis itself, we expect to start ramping up later in the year and into the new year as the government spending review becomes sort of more settled. And of course, the devolved administrations are key funders of the CCRA process. So we will reach out to them and loop them in when the time is right to have that discussion.
Okay, great. Well, and I think we can get the final question here as well in. We've got 1 more minute, which is, who'd be a good person in government then to get in touch about the skill gap that Chris mentioned? I think you were talking about the economists, economists being able to deal with uncertainty, decision-making under uncertainty. And I think there's actually other skill gaps as well, just in climate services, to be able to translate some of the science to organizations. I'm wondering if it's you, Andrew, as head of evidence, but Bays has got skills in their government department title. And maybe we can, if we don't have an answer now, maybe we can post it on the website later. But I wonder whether there is someone.
I mean, we're all at the mercy of budget, and we make decisions within the constraints of the budget that we have. So we don't have a huge amount of influence over filling skills gaps for scientists and economists and that type of thing. We can say we need more here, there, and everywhere, but it's not always necessarily with the budgets that we have. I would have to say that I would have to defer to Bays on something like that as the larger department that is more responsible for those types of things across government, the professions across government that they manage. They might be able to give you a better answer if you can find the right person there.
I think just touching on what Andrew said, I think there's a couple of things that come to mind for me. One is department specific guidance. So departments do their own, have their own L&D programs. So there's definitely something that can be done within that space, subject to budgets, as Andrew said. But there's also profession-specific guidance. So, for example, within the Government Economic Service, they put on a whole host of training for economists at varying different levels. And so there's definitely something with getting those professions and the departments that run professions, so Cabinet Office, for example, in terms of getting some of these things onto profession training programs. So not just having an introductory session, say, for economists on the green, but also on the climate side of it as well. So I think there's kind of two levels that can be attached or go through in that respect. But again, Bays is also one of the heavy hitters, so probably something that we wanted to go through them as well.
Great, thank you so much, Andrew and Chris, for answering all the questions. And giving us an insight into government policy and also the economics. So I think what's left for me to do is really just to advertise the next few webinars. So the next one we're going to have is after COP. So Jamie Hannaford is going to come and talk to us about the EFLAG project, which has been looking at future stream flow and groundwater levels to feed into the water resources sector, so particularly looking at droughts and water quantity in particular. And then afterwards, we're going to have a slightly longer meeting with Hayley Fowler and colleagues about the future drainage project, which is just finished, which again is informing new climate uplifts. And so we'll be discussing what are the implications for surface water flooding in the UK. So the link is at the bottom there for you to register. So hopefully I'll see some of you folks then. But in the meantime, thank you very much for attending. And as I said earlier, this recording will be up on the website and on our YouTube channel sometime this week. So thanks everyone for watching, and see you soon. Bye.